Administration and economy. The changes brought to Egypt by the Ptolemies were momentous. The land's resources were harnessed with unparalleled efficiency, making Egypt the wealthiest of the Hellenistic kingdoms. The amount of land under cultivation was increased, and new crops were introduced. Especially important was the introduction of naked tetraploid wheat, Triticum durum, to replace the traditional husked emmer, Triticum dicocum. The population, estimated at 3 to 4 million in the late dynastic period, may have more than doubled by the early Roman period to a level not reached again until the late 19th century. Some of the increase was due to immigration. Particularly during the 2nd and 3rd centuries, many settlers were attracted from cities in Anatolia, Asia Minor, and the Greek islands, and large numbers of Jews came from Palestine. The flow may have decreased later in the Ptolemaic period, and it is often suggested that there was a serious decline in prosperity in the 1st century BCE. If so, there may have been some reversal of this trend under Cleopatra VII. The foundation of the prosperity was the governmental system devised to exploit the country's economic resources. Directly below the monarch were a handful of powerful officials whose authority extended over the entire land: a chief finance minister, a chief accountant, and a chancery of ministers in charge of records, letters, and decrees. A level below them lay the broadening base of a pyramid of subordinate officials with authority in limited areas, which extended down to the chief administrator of each village, Comarches. Between the chief ministers and the village officials stood those such as the Noma steward, Oikonomos, and the Strategoi, whose jurisdiction extended over one of the more than 30 nomes, the long-established geographic divisions of Egypt. In theory, this bureaucracy could regulate and control the economic activities of every subject in the land, its smooth operation guaranteed by the multiplicity of officials capable of checking up on one another. In practice, it is difficult to see a rigid civil service mentality at work, involving clear demarcation of departments. Specific functions might well have been performed by different officials according to local need and the availability of a person competent to take appropriate action. By the same token, rigid lines of separation between military, civil, legal, and administrative matters are difficult to perceive. The same official might perform duties in one or all of these areas. The military was inevitably integrated into civilian life because its soldiers were also farmers who enjoyed royal grants of land, either as Greek clerics, holders of allotments, with higher status and generous grants, or as native Egyptian mashimoi with small plots. Interlocking judiciary institutions, in the form of Greek and Egyptian courts, Krematistai and Laokritai, provided the means for Greeks and Egyptians to regulate their legal relationships according to the language in which they conducted their business. The bureaucratic power was heavily weighted in favor of the Greek speakers, the dominant elite. Egyptians were nevertheless able to obtain official posts in the bureaucracy, gradually infiltrating to the highest levels. But in order to do so, they had to Hellenize. The basis of Egypt's legendary wealth was the highly productive land, which technically remained in royal ownership. A considerable portion was kept under the control of temples, and the remainder was leased out on a theoretically revocable basis to tenant farmers. A portion was also available to be granted as gifts to leading courtiers. One of these was Apollonius, the finance minister of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who had an estate of 10,000 aurauri, about 6,500 acres, 2,630 hectares, at Philadelphia in Al-Fayoum. Tenants and beneficiaries were able to behave very much as if these leases and grants were private property. The revenues in cash and kind were enormous, and royal control extended to the manufacture and marketing of almost all important products, including papyrus, oil, linen, and beer. An extraordinarily detailed set of revenue laws, promulgated under Ptolemy II Philadelphus, laid down rules for the way in which officials were to monitor the production of such commodities. In fact, the Ptolemaic economy was very much a mixture of direct royal ownership and exploitation by private enterprise under regulated conditions. One fundamental and far-reaching Ptolemaic innovation was the systematic monetization of the economy. The monarchy also controlled this from top to bottom by operating a closed monetary system which permitted only the royal coinage to circulate within Egypt. A sophisticated banking system underpinned this practice, operating again with a mixture of direct royal control and private enterprise, and handling both private financial transactions and those that directed money into and out of the royal coffers. One important concomitant of this change was an enormous increase in the volume of trade, both within Egypt and abroad, which eventually reached its climax under the peaceful conditions of Roman rule. There, the position and role of Alexandria as the major port and trading entrepot was crucial. The city handled a great volume of Egypt's domestic produce, as well as the import and export of luxury goods to and from the east and the cities of the eastern Mediterranean. It developed its own importance as an artistic center, the products of which found ready markets throughout the Mediterranean. Alexandrian glassware and jewelry were particularly fine. Greek-style sculpture of the late Ptolemaic period shows a special excellence, and it is likely that the city was also the major production center for high-quality mosaic work. Religion and culture. The Ptolemies were powerful supporters of the native Egyptian religious foundations. However, their economic and political power was carefully controlled by the dynasty. A great deal of the late building and restoration work in many of the most important Egyptian temples is Ptolemaic, particularly from the period of about 150–50. Ptolemaic monarchs appear on temple reliefs in the traditional forms of the Egyptian kings. The native traditions persisted in village temples and local cults, many having particular associations with species of sacred animals or birds. At the same time, the Greeks created their own identifications of Egyptian deities, identifying Ammon with Zeus, Horus with Apollo, Ptah with Hephaestus, and so on. They also gave some deities, such as Isis, a more universal significance that ultimately resulted in the spread of her mystery cult throughout the Mediterranean world. The impact of the Greeks is most obvious in two phenomena. One is the formalized royal cult of Alexander and the Ptolemies, which evidently served both a political and a religious purpose. The other is the creation of the cult of Serapis, which at first was confined to Alexandria but soon became universal. The god was represented as a Hellenized deity, and the form of cult is Greek, but its essence is the old Egyptian notion that the sacred Apis bull merged its divinity in some way with the god Osiris when it died. The continuing vitality of the native Egyptian artistic tradition is clearly and abundantly expressed in the temple architecture and the sculpture of the Ptolemaic period. The Egyptian language continued to be used in its hieroglyphic and demotic forms until late in the Roman period. It also survived through the Byzantine period and beyond in the form of Coptic. The Egyptian literary tradition flourished vigorously in the Ptolemaic period and produced a large number of works in demotic. The genre most commonly represented is the romantic tale, exemplified by several story cycles, which are typically set in the native pharaonic milieu and involve the gods, royal figures, magic, romance, and the trials and combats of heroes. Another important category is the instruction text, the best known of the period being the Instruction of Untitled, which consists of a list of moralizing maxims composed, as the story goes, when its eponymous author was imprisoned for having failed to inform the king of an assassination plot. Another example, known as Papyrus Insinger, is a more narrowly moralizing text, but the arrival of a Greek-speaking elite had an enormous impact on cultural patterns. The Egyptian story cycles were probably affected by Greek influence. Literary and technical works were translated into Greek, and, under royal patronage, an Egyptian priest named Manetho of Sebennytos wrote an account of the kings of Egypt in Greek. Most striking is the diffusion of the works of the poets and playwrights of classical Greece among the literate Greeks in the towns and villages of the Nile River Valley. Thus, there are clear signs of the existence of two interacting but distinct cultural traditions in Ptolemaic Egypt. This was certainly reflected in a broader social context. The written sources offer little direct evidence of ethnic discrimination by Greeks against Egyptians, but Greek and Egyptian consciousness of the Greeks' social and economic superiority comes through strongly from time to time. Intermarriage was one means, though not the only one, by which Egyptians could better their status and Hellenize. Many native Egyptians learned to speak Greek, some to write it as well. Some even went so far as to adopt Greek names in an attempt to assimilate themselves to the elite group. Alexandria occupied a unique place in the history of literature, ideas, scholarship, and science for almost a millennium after the death of its founder. Under the royal patronage of the Ptolemies and in an environment almost oblivious to its Egyptian surroundings, Greek culture was preserved and developed. Early in the Ptolemaic period, probably in the reign of Ptolemy Soter, but possibly in that of Ptolemy's II Philadelphus. The Alexandrian Museum, Greek Mouseion, seat of the Muses, was established within the palace complex. The geographer and historian Strabo, who saw it early in the Roman period, described it as having a covered walk, an arcade with recesses and seats, and a large house containing the dining hall of the members of the museum, who lived a communal existence. The Library of Alexandria, together with its offshoot in the Serapeum, was indispensable to the functioning of the scholarly community in the museum. Books were collected voraciously under the Ptolemies, and at its height, the library's collection probably numbered 500,000 or more papyrus rolls, most of them containing more than one work. The major poets of the Hellenistic period, Theocritus, Callimachus, and Apollonius of Rhodes, all took up residence and wrote there. Scholarship flourished, preserving and ordering the manuscript traditions of much of the classical literature from Homer onward. Librarian scholars such as Aristophanes of Byzantium and his pupil Aristarchus made critical additions and wrote commentaries and works on grammar. Also notable was the cultural influence of Alexandria's Jewish community, which is inferred from the fact that the Pentateuch was first translated into Greek at Alexandria during the Ptolemaic period. One byproduct of this kind of activity was that Alexandria became the center of the book trade, and the works of the classical authors were copied there and diffused among a literate Greek readership scattered in the towns and villages of the Nile Valley. The Alexandrian achievement in scientific fields was also enormous. Great advances were made in pure mathematics, mechanics, physics, geography, and medicine. Euclid worked in Alexandria about 300 BCE and achieved the systematization of the whole existing corpus of mathematical knowledge and the development of the method of proof by deduction from axioms. Archimedes was there in the 3rd century and is said to have invented the Archimedes screw when he was in Egypt. Eratosthenes calculated Earth's circumference and was the first to attempt a map of the world based on a system of lines of latitude and longitude. The School of Medicine, founded in the Ptolemaic period, retained its leading reputation into the Byzantine era. Late in the Ptolemaic period, Alexandria began to develop as a great center of Greek philosophical studies as well. In fact, there was no field of literary, intellectual, or scientific activity to which Ptolemaic Alexandria failed to make an important contribution. The Macedonian Greek character of the monarchy was vigorously preserved. There is no more emphatic sign of this than the growth and importance of the city of Alexandria. It had been founded, on a date traditionally given as April 7, 331, but often cited as 332, by Alexander the Great on the site of the insignificant Egyptian village of Rhakotis in the northwestern Nile River Delta, and it ranked as the most important city in the eastern Mediterranean until the foundation of Constantinople in the 4th century CE. The importance of the new Greek city was soon emphasized by contrast to its Egyptian surroundings when the royal capital was transferred, within a few years of Alexander's death, from Memphis to Alexandria. The Ptolemaic court cultivated extravagant luxury in the Greek style in its magnificent and steadily expanding palace complex, which occupied as much as a third of the city by the early Roman period. Its grandeur was emphasized in the reign of Ptolemy II Philadelphus by the foundation of the quadrennial festival, the Ptolemaica, which featured a procession of elaborate floats with Greek religious themes.